The rain had been relentless for days, a cold, drumming soundtrack to Sarah's new beginning. Moving into her first apartment after the breakup was meant to be liberating, a fresh start. She had found the place on a community board, tucked away in an aging building at the edge of town. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord had shrugged off her questions with a casual, "The last tenant moved out suddenly. Work transfer, I think." The first few nights were uneventful, aside from the faint groaning of the building settling and the occasional scratching from what she assumed were mice in the walls. The apartment had a distinct musty odor she couldn't quite shake, no matter how many candles she lit or how often she opened the windows. The only odd feature was a heavy metal hatch in the living room floor, bolted shut with a padlock. Sarah assumed it led to some old crawl space or disused utility area. She didn't think much of it. On the third night, she woke up to the sound of faint knocking. Sitting up in bed, she strained to locate the noise. It wasn't coming from her door nor the windows. It seemed to echo from below. The hatch! She shook her head, muttering to herself about the quirks of old buildings, and went back to sleep. But the sound persisted the next night. It was slow, deliberate. Not the skittering of an animal, but purposeful. By the end of the week, the knocking had evolved into something worse. Scraping. Long, slow scratches that started at odd hours and stopped abruptly, leaving her in silence and dread. Her landlord dismissed her concerns when she called. "That hatch hasn't been opened in years," he said. "Probably just rats." His indifference felt rehearsed. Sarah's unease grew. She avoided the hatch, placing furniture over it as if that could erase its presence. Yet in the dead of night, the noises became more insistent. One evening, after hearing what sounded like a faint voice calling her name, she decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. She went to the hardware store the next day and bought bolt cutters. That night, armed with a flashlight and trembling hands, she removed the padlock. As the hatch creaked open, the smell that rose was suffocating, a mixture of rot and damp earth. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. She hesitated, but something compelled her to descend. The stairs led to a small room, the walls lined with crumbling stone. In the center was a wooden chair, and on it sat a crumpled figure. It looked human, but the skin was pale and stretched tight, the eyes hollow pits. As Sarah approached, the figure's head jerked upward with a creak like snapping branches, and its mouth opened wide in a voiceless scream. Sarah stumbled backward, tripping over something soft. Her flashlight revealed a pile of bones, tangled with scraps of clothing she recognized. A blue scarf, a leather wallet, items she had seen in the apartment's lost and found bin upstairs. Panic surged through her. She scrambled up the stairs, slamming the hatch shut behind her. But the noises didn't stop. That night, the knocking turned into pounding, the voice into a chorus of agonized whispers that seeped through the walls. The next morning, Sarah fled. She left the furniture, the deposit, everything. But even as she drove away, the sound of knocking echoed faintly in her ears. Weeks later, when she tried to warn others about the apartment, she found no record of the listing, no trace of the landlord. The building itself seemed to have vanished, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. But Sarah knew what she had seen. And on sleepless nights when the world was quiet, she swore she could still hear the knocking, no longer beneath her, but inside the walls of her own mind. The move to 12B felt like a dream at first. Dana had spent months searching for an affordable apartment in the city. When she found the listing for the charming one-bedroom in a historic building, she thought she'd hit the jackpot. The ornate moldings, creaky wooden floors, and old-fashioned charm made it feel like stepping back in time. The landlord, Mr. Keller, seemed pleasant enough, though he gave off a strange vibe. His smiles were quick and tight, like his gaze always darting as if he expected someone to appear behind him. Dana noticed the oddities on the first night. As she unpacked, she swore she felt cold drafts sweeping through the apartment, even though the windows were shut tight. She dismissed it as old building quirks. But by the second night, the drafts carried something with them. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to swirl around her, fading whenever she turned on the lights. At first, Dana thought she was just tired. Moving was exhausting, and maybe her nerves were on edge. But the whispers grew louder, almost conversational, though she couldn't make out the words. She started waking up at 3:33 a.m. every night, like clockwork. Each time, the room felt colder than before, and the whispers seemed closer, almost next to her bed. One evening, as she hung a picture in the living room, she noticed something peculiar about the wall. The plaster seemed slightly uneven in spots. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she tapped along the surface, feeling for a hollow space. Sure enough, there was one, a hidden cavity behind the wall. Excited by the mystery, she borrowed a hammer and chipped away at the plaster. What she found behind it wasn't what she expected. A small, cramped crawl space stretched behind the wall, the air inside stifling and damp. Scattered across the floor were dozens of personal belongings. Watches, bracelets, photographs, and notebooks, all caked in dust. Dana's heart raced as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't just forgotten trinkets. They were keepsakes, abandoned and hidden. But why? At the bottom of the pile, she found an old leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with frantic handwriting. It belonged to a woman named Evelyn, a former tenant of 12B. Evelyn wrote about the voices she had heard, the shadows she had seen moving just out of sight, and the dreams. The last entry was chilling. I keep waking up at 3:33. They're in the walls now. They know I can hear them. Dana froze, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt heavy, suffocating. From behind her, she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor. She whipped around, but no one was there. Yet, she could feel something watching her, just beyond the edge of the dim light. That night, she barely slept. When 3:33 a.m. came, the whispers returned, but now they were louder, and she could make out fragments. Help us? They took us. Don't let them. Terrified, Dana decided to confront Mr. Keller. She stormed into his office the next morning, clutching the diary and demanding answers. His expression darkened as soon as he saw it. "You shouldn't have gone looking," he muttered. "Some things are better left alone." Keller confessed reluctantly. The building, he said, had a history. Tenants in 12B always left or disappeared. "They say it's the apartment," he whispered. "It draws people in, keeps them here, even after they're gone." That evening, as Dana packed her belongings in a rush, she felt a strange heaviness in the air. The apartment seemed darker, colder, as though it knew she was leaving. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and frantic, screaming for her to stay. Just as she reached the door, she heard it. A deep, guttural voice she had never heard before. "You can't leave. You're ours." The lights flickered, and the door slammed shut in front of her. She pulled and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows began to creep toward her, the walls seeming to breathe and close in. In a final, desperate act, she smashed the window and climbed out, cutting her hands as she scrambled onto the fire escape. When she finally made it to the street, she turned back to look at the apartment. The window to 12B was dark, but as she stared, she saw a figure standing there, silhouetted against the void. It was her, an exact copy, staring down at her with a vacant smile. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Dana never returned to collect her things. Weeks later, when she worked up the nerve to drive by the building, it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown and forgotten. But at night, when she closes her eyes, she can still hear the whispers, faint and relentless, calling her name. It was supposed to be a short-term rental. Jason, a freelance writer, needed a quiet space to finish his latest project, and the listing for the apartment on Oak Ridge Drive seemed perfect. It was tucked away in a quiet part of town with a view of the woods and a low monthly rate. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Armitage, had seemed overly eager to rent it out. She handed Jason the keys with trembling hands and said, "Just don't use the closet in the master bedroom. It's been sealed for a reason." Jason had laughed it off, thinking it was just an eccentricity. When he arrived, the apartment was as advertised, clean, quiet, and entirely unremarkable. The closet door in the master bedroom, however, was unmistakable. It was an old wooden door, slightly warped, with several thick iron bolts securing it shut. It looked like something out of a medieval castle, completely out of place in the otherwise modern apartment. The first night was uneventful, save for the peculiar creaks and groans of the old building. Jason chalked it up to settling wood and the wind outside, but by the second night, he began to notice the noises weren't random. They were rhythmic, almost like faint knocking, coming from the direction of the bolted closet. Jason tried to ignore it. He was here to work, not to get wrapped up in superstitions, but the knocking grew louder each night, and it began to sound deliberate. On the fourth night, as he lay awake in bed, the knocking was accompanied by something else, a voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down his spine. "Let me out!" Jason sat up, heart pounding. He told himself it was his imagination, the product of too many late nights and too much coffee. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Please, help me. Against his better judgment, Jason approached the closet. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath. The voice was coming from inside. Don't leave me here. It's so dark. His hands hovered over the bolts. He hesitated, remembering Mrs. Armitage's warning. But the voice, it sounded so human, so desperate. He grabbed a wrench and began loosening the bolts. As the final one came free, the knocking stopped. The apartment fell silent, unnaturally so. Jason pushed the door open. Inside was nothing but darkness. His flashlight revealed an empty, narrow space, the walls lined with scratches, as if someone had clawed at them for years. The air was icy, and the smell of damp earth was overwhelming. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into pitch black. Jason fumbled for the door, but his hands found nothing but smooth walls. Then he heard it, a deep guttural growl and the sensation of something cold brushing against his neck. You shouldn't have opened it. The voice was no longer pleading. It was mocking, menacing. He screamed, banging on the walls, but the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, Mrs. Armitage stood outside the apartment, a locksmith by her side. She sighed as she placed new bolts on the closet door. They never listen, she muttered. The listing for the apartment was back online by that afternoon. The ad for the apartment came at just the right time. Mia had been evicted from her last place after losing her job, and she was desperate for somewhere cheap. The listing for Unit 6 in an old, ivy-covered building seemed like a godsend. The landlord, Mr. Dempsey, was eager to rent it out, almost too eager. It's a little different, he said with a nervous laugh as he handed her the keys. But the neighbors are quiet, and you won't have any trouble here. Just don't move the mirror in the hallway. Mia was too relieved to care about his odd warning. The apartment was clean, albeit a bit dated, with faded wallpaper and creaky floors. The mirror he mentioned was a tall, antique thing bolted to the wall near the entrance. Its tarnished surface warped her reflection slightly, making her appear thinner, taller. It gave her a shiver, but she shrugged it off. The first few nights were uneventful, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when she passed the mirror, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, her reflection was still. By the third night, strange things began happening. Mia would wake to faint noises, soft whispers, like multiple voices speaking just beyond her hearing. The air in the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. Once, as she brushed her teeth, she swore her reflection lingered for just a second longer than it should have after she turned away. She called Mr. Dempsey to ask about the mirror. I told you not to mess with it, he snapped, his tone sharp. It's been there since before I owned the place. Don't try to move it. But the warnings only fueled Mia's curiosity. That night, unable to sleep, she stood in front of the mirror with a flashlight. She examined the edges, noticing faint, rust-colored stains on the frame. Blood? No, it had to be rust, she thought, trying to calm herself. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, her reflection smiled. Mia froze. Her own face, her mouth hadn't moved. She stumbled back, her breath shallow. That was it. She decided the mirror had to go. She grabbed a screwdriver and began working on the bolts. They were old and stubborn, but she managed to pry them loose. The mirror toppled forward with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow passage behind it. The space reeked of decay, and a cool draft wafted out, carrying the faint sound of whispers. Shining her flashlight inside, Mia saw what looked like scratch marks lining the walls, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way out. At the far end of the passage was a small, crumpled figure. It was a woman, or what was left of her, skeletal, her brittle fingers curled against the wall. Her hollow eye sockets seemed to stare right at Mia. Beside the body was an old leather-bound journal. With shaking hands, Mia opened it. The entries were frantic, written by someone trapped. The mirror won't let me leave. It watches me, keeps me here. I see them in the glass now. They're waiting for me to join them. As she read, a shadow passed over the page. Mia looked up and froze. Her reflection was back in the mirror, even though it now leaned against the opposite wall. But this time, it wasn't mimicking her movements. The other Mia smiled, her eyes dark and hollow. Slowly, the reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a bloody smear. The whispering grew louder and the room seemed to close in. Mia screamed and ran for the door, but no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the mirror's surface rippled like water. The other Mia stepped out, grinning, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. The next tenant to move into Unit 6 found the mirror bolted back in place. They never saw or heard from Mia again. But sometimes at night, they thought they saw someone else in the glass, a pale figure, screaming silently, trying to claw her way out. Emily moved into apartment 3C in the middle of winter. The building was old, with cracked paint and dim hallways lit by flickering bulbs, but it was all she could afford after her breakup. The apartment itself was cozy enough, except for the strange, thick stains on the hardwood floor in the bedroom. The landlord brushed it off when she asked about it. "Just water damage," he said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." That night, as Emily unpacked, she noticed something odd. No matter how warm she set the thermostat, the bedroom remained freezing. She tried using space heaters, but the cold persisted, as if the chill seeped directly from the floor. She piled on blankets, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept hearing faint noises, soft creaks and groans, as though someone were pacing beneath her bed. The next morning, Emily dragged the bed to a different corner of the room, away from the stains. As she moved the frame, a faint metallic clink caught her attention. Beneath the bed, embedded in the wood, was a rusty iron ring, like a handle. It was part of a trapdoor. Emily hesitated. The idea of a hidden door in her apartment was both thrilling and unnerving, but curiosity got the better of her. She pried it open, coughing as a wave of stale, earthy air rushed up. Beneath the floor was a dark, narrow space. It wasn't deep, just enough to crawl in, but it stretched far beyond the dimensions of her room. Her flashlight illuminated the space below, revealing something that made her stomach twist. A row of handprints smudged into the dirt walls, leading further into the darkness. Emily slammed the trapdoor shut. That night, the noises grew louder. The groans became whispers, unintelligible but insistent, rising and falling like a chant. She stuffed earplugs into her ears, but they couldn't block the sound. Around 3 a.m., the whispers stopped, and that's when she felt it. The mattress dipped beside her. It wasn't a slight movement. Something heavy was sitting there. Frozen with fear, she opened her eyes and saw an outline in the dark. A figure hunched over her, its face mere inches from hers. She couldn't see its features, but she could feel its breath, cold, damp, and wrong. It didn't move, and neither did she. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then it whispered, "You shouldn't have opened it." Emily screamed and bolted for the living room, slamming the door behind her. She spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on. The next morning, she called the landlord, demanding answers. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something sinister in his tone. "You opened the door, didn't you?" he said. "What is it?" she demanded. There was a long pause before he replied, "That space is older than the building, older than the ground it stands on. We've tried to seal it, but it doesn't stay shut for long. You shouldn't have opened it." He hung up before she could say anything else. Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She packed what little she had and left the apartment that afternoon. She never went back, never asked for her deposit. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she can hear the whispers. Faint and distant, they follow her no matter where she goes, as if something crawled out of the trapdoor and decided to stay. The building was one of those grand, decaying relics of the 1920s, with high ceilings, ornate crown moldings, and a permanent musty smell that no amount of cleaning could erase. Apartment Struss 7F was all Rose could afford, and despite its quirks, it had a certain charm. The first thing she noticed was the doorbell. It didn't work. When she pressed the button during the walkthrough, the landlord had frowned and muttered, "It's best that it stays broken." Rose dismissed his cryptic comment as odd but harmless. She wasn't planning on hosting many guests anyway. Her first week in the apartment was peaceful. She loved the large windows that let in the morning sun, and the building's quiet atmosphere was a welcome change from her previous place. But on the 7th night, she was jolted awake by the sound of the doorbell. It was loud, shrill, and unmistakable. She stumbled out of bed, her heart racing. No one should have been able to ring it. She peeked through the peephole but saw no one. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the elevator at the end of the corridor. The next night, it happened again, and the night after that. By the fourth night, Rose was furious. She called the landlord the next morning. "I thought you said the doorbell was broken," she snapped. "It is," he said flatly. There was a pause, then a sigh. "Look, I didn't want to scare you, but this has happened before. 7F is..." He stopped himself. "You didn't hear anything else, did you?" "What do you mean? Like what?" Rose asked. "Voices," he said quietly. "Or footsteps." She hadn't, but the thought made her stomach churn. She brushed him off, though, refusing to believe in ghost stories. That night, Rose stayed awake, determined to catch whoever was messing with her. She sat by the door with the peephole covered, her phone ready to record. The hours dragged by, and just as she began to nod off, the bell rang again. Her finger froze over the camera app. The air felt heavy, charged, and the sound of the bell seemed to echo unnaturally long. She peeked through the peephole and gasped. A figure stood in the hallway, but it wasn't right. Its body was too tall, its limbs too long and thin, and its face was blank, like a smear of shadow. It didn't move, didn't shift, but just stood there as if it knew she was watching. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and knocked on the door. The knocks were impossibly loud, reverberating through the walls. Rose stumbled back, dropping her phone. She grabbed a chair and braced it under the doorknob, her hands shaking. The knocking stopped, but the silence was worse. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Rose went to the landlord, demanding to know what was going on. He was reluctant at first, but finally he told her. Years ago, a man had lived in 7F, a recluse, barely seen by the other tenants. One night, he was found dead in the hallway outside his door. No one knew why he had left the apartment or who had rung his bell that night. But ever since, strange things had been happening to anyone who moved in. "They say he's still looking for whoever rang the bell that night," the landlord said, his voice barely a whisper. Rose packed her things that same afternoon. She didn't care about her lease or the deposit, she just needed to leave. As she descended the stairs, dragging her suitcase, she heard it again. The doorbell, loud and insistent. It echoed through the stairwell, each ring sharper than the last. She ran, nearly tripping over her own feet. She didn't look back. Even now, in her new place, she keeps a chair braced under her front door at night. But sometimes, just as she's about to fall asleep, she hears it again, the faint echo of a doorbell, distant but unmistakable. Ben had always considered himself lucky when he found the top-floor unit of Pinewood Manor, a building that loomed over the edge of the city's oldest cemetery. The rent was cheap, the view was stunning, and he loved the quiet. What he didn't love was the tiny locked door in the hallway closet. It was set low in the back wall, no bigger than a small safe, and painted the same shade of beige as the rest of the closet. When Ben asked the landlord about it during his walkthrough, she had waved him off. "Oh, it's just storage," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Nothing you need to bother with." Ben tried to forget about it, but the door had a strange way of drawing his attention. It was as though it wanted to be noticed. By his second week, he couldn't resist anymore. He inspected the little door closely, running his fingers along its edges. There was no handle, just a keyhole that seemed rusted shut. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the closet. He froze, straining to listen. It stopped the moment he stepped into the hallway. By the third night, the tapping was accompanied by whispers. They were soft, almost pleading, but he couldn't make out any words. "Hello," he called, his voice shaking. The whispers stopped. The next morning, Ben decided to call the landlord again. She answered on the first ring. "I told you not to worry about that door," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't open it. Do you hear me? It's sealed for a reason." Sealed for a reason? The cryptic warning only made Ben more curious. That night, he sat in front of the little door, flashlight in hand. The tapping had returned, louder now, more insistent. He grabbed a screwdriver and pried at the edges. The old paint and wood gave way easily, revealing the door's true purpose. Behind it was a small compartment, barely large enough to hold anything substantial. At first, it seemed empty, but when Ben shined his flashlight inside, he saw them, deep gouges like scratch marks crisscrossing the walls, and something else, a tiny bundle wrapped in faded cloth. He reached in and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was an old photograph of a woman and child, their faces blurred and faded with time. Beneath the photo was a necklace, its delicate chain broken, and a small leather-bound book. Ben opened the book, his hands trembling. The handwriting inside was frantic, scrawled across the pages as if the writer had been in a hurry. They're in the walls. They watch through the little door. Don't listen to the tapping. Don't open it. The words ended abruptly, the rest of the pages smeared with dark stains. As Ben stared at the book, the tapping grew louder, now coming from all around him. The closet door creaked open behind him, though he was certain he had shut it. And then he heard it. A soft, rasping breath, just inches from his ear. "Why did you open it?" a voice whispered. Ben turned, but the hallway was empty. The little door, however, was no longer empty. Inside, two pale, skeletal hands were clawing their way out. He scrambled back, slamming the closet door shut. The tapping turned to pounding, the sound vibrating through the walls. The next day, Ben moved out without a word to the landlord. He left everything behind, including the photograph and the necklace. The apartment is still listed for rent, but the landlord never warns anyone about the little door anymore. It's been painted over again, and the whispers are patient. They always wait for someone curious enough to pry it open. Leah didn't want to move into the apartment on Maple Street, but after her divorce, she didn't have many choices. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord was eager to have her as a tenant. "It's perfect for someone starting fresh," he had said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The apartment itself was fine, a bit old, with creaky floors and dim lighting, but Leah liked the tall windows and the way the late afternoon sun spilled into the living room. She thought she could make it work, until she noticed the light switch. It was in the hallway, near the bedroom door, an old-fashioned push-button switch with a cracked ivory plate. It didn't seem to connect to any light, no matter how many times she pressed it. When she asked the landlord about it, his smile faltered. "Oh, that doesn't do anything. It's just left over from an old system," he said quickly. "Don't worry about it." But Leah did worry, especially when she noticed that the switch seemed to reset itself. Every time she walked past, it was in the off position, even if she was sure she had left it on. The first night, she heard the noises. Faint at first, a soft scratching like nails against wood. It was coming from the hallway near the switch. She told herself it was just the old building settling. By the third night, the scratching had grown louder, more deliberate, as though something was trying to get her attention. That's when the lights started flickering. At first, it was just the bulb in the kitchen, then the living room lamp. On the fifth night, the bedroom light went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. Leah grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the hallway, intending to check the breaker box. But as she passed the switch, the scratching stopped. Her flashlight beam caught something, a shadow too large to be hers, moving across the wall near the switch. It didn't make sense. There was no one else in the apartment. She stared at the switch, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The moment she pressed it, the scratching began again, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't just scratching. There was a voice. "Turn it off." It was a low, guttural whisper coming from behind the wall. Leah stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the hallway. For a split second, she saw something. A figure, impossibly thin, with long, bony fingers pressed against the wall as though trying to push through. She ran to the landlord the next morning, demanding to know what was wrong with the apartment. His face turned pale. "I told you not to mess with that switch," he said. "It's not supposed to be there anymore. The old tenant." He trailed off, avoiding her gaze. "What happened to them?" Leah demanded. He hesitated, then sighed. "The wiring in this building is old. Years ago, there was a fire in that unit. A man died trying to escape. He was trapped in the hallway, near the switch. Ever since, strange things happen when people mess with it. It's like he never left." Leah didn't sleep that night. The scratching returned, louder and more aggressive, until it sounded like something was clawing at the walls. At 3:33 a.m., the lights flickered one last time and went out completely. The switch clicked to the on position all by itself. Then came the voice again, this time right behind her. "You shouldn't have touched it." Leah fled the apartment the next day, leaving everything behind. When the landlord came to inspect the unit, he found the hallway walls gouged deep with scratches and the switch plate cracked in half. The apartment is still vacant, but at night, passersby say they see the hallway light flicker on and off, and sometimes, if you're close enough, you can hear the scratching. When Eric signed the lease for apartment 4B, the landlord was unusually insistent about one thing. Don't open the dumbwaiter. It's sealed for your safety. Eric had laughed it off. The dumbwaiter, a relic from when the building had been a luxury hotel, was nothing more than a wooden compartment with a pulley system, long out of use. It was bolted shut, the edges sealed with layers of faded paint. At first, life in the apartment was uneventful. Eric enjoyed the high ceilings, the old-world charm, and the quiet atmosphere. But after a week, he started noticing things. It began at night. Around 2 a.m., a faint creaking sound, like ropes straining under weight, would echo through the walls. At first, Eric thought it was just the old building settling. But as the nights wore on, the creaking grew louder, more deliberate, as if something was moving through the walls. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He stood in front of the dumbwaiter, pressing his ear to the painted-over door. The sound was clearer now, a rhythmic squeak of pulleys followed by soft, muffled thuds as if something was being hauled up or down. "Old pipes," he muttered to himself, backing away. But then the knocking started. It was faint at first, a soft tap, tap, tap from the dumbwaiter door. Eric froze. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The tapping stopped. He held his breath, listening. A moment later, it returned. Louder, faster, more insistent. Against his better judgment, Eric grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox. His hands shook as he pried at the dumbwaiter's bolted door. The wood groaned, and with a final wrench, it came loose. Behind the door was darkness. A narrow shaft stretched upward and downward, the walls lined with cobwebs and decades of dust. But as Eric leaned in to shine his flashlight, he noticed something strange. A smell. It was rancid and sweet, like rotting meat. He gagged and stumbled back. That's when he saw it, movement in the shadows below. A pair of pale, gnarled hands gripped the edges of the dumbwaiter's compartment, pulling it upward. The compartment itself was empty, but something clung to its sides. The hands were followed by thin, skeletal arms and then a head, hairless, with eyes that glowed faintly in the beam of his flashlight. The thing smiled at him, its teeth too many and too sharp. "You shouldn't have opened it," it whispered. Eric screamed and slammed the door shut, jamming the crowbar against it for good measure. He fled the apartment that night, leaving behind all his belongings. The next morning, he called the landlord to tell him what had happened. "I warned you," the landlord said, his tone grim. "That dumbwaiter hasn't worked in decades, but some tenants, they hear things, see things. I've sealed it up over and over, but it always finds a way out." Eric never returned to the building. Months later, a new tenant moved into 4B. They found the dumbwaiter sealed shut again, with no sign of Eric's crowbar. But late at night, they often hear the same creaking sound. Sometimes it's accompanied by tapping, faint but deliberate, as if something is still waiting inside. Jenna moved into apartment 12A on a rainy Tuesday evening. The building, a crumbling brick structure from the 1940s, had an air of forgotten grandeur. Her unit was small but affordable, and after months of couch surfing, it felt like a blessing. On her first night, she noticed something odd, a circular stain on the ceiling above her bed. It was faint, almost like a watermark, but its shape was strangely perfect, as though someone had drawn it with precision. She mentioned it to the building's maintenance man the next day. He glanced up at the ceiling, his face tightening. "Don't worry about it," he muttered. "If it gets worse, call me." That night, Jenna lay in bed, staring at the stain. The storm outside rattled the windows, and she could hear water dripping somewhere, a steady plink, plink, plink that seemed to echo through the room. She couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't the bathroom, the kitchen, or even the windowsill. By the second night, the stain had darkened, turning a sickly brown. The dripping sound was louder now, almost rhythmic, and it made sleep impossible. At 3 a.m., she finally snapped. Grabbing a flashlight, she stood on her bed and pressed her fingers against the stain. The ceiling felt damp, and for a moment she thought she could feel something pulsing beneath her touch. That's when the dripping stopped. Relieved, she turned off the flashlight and climbed back into bed. But just as she began to drift off, a soft sound pulled her back to wakefulness. It wasn't dripping anymore. It was breathing. A shallow, raspy exhale as though someone was just on the other side of the ceiling. Jenna's heart pounded as she stared at the dark stain above her. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and then she saw it. Movement. The stain rippled like a bubble being pushed from the other side. Suddenly, a single drop of dark liquid seeped through, landing on her forehead. It was warm. She screamed, scrambling off the bed and grabbing her phone to call the maintenance man. He answered groggily but came upstairs immediately. By the time he arrived, the stain was gone. The ceiling was dry, and the room was silent. "I told you not to worry about it," he said, his tone harsher this time. "But there was something," Jenna stammered. "It was breathing, and—" "Listen," he interrupted. "This building is old. The pipes, the wiring, all of it. It messes with people. You'll get used to it." Jenna wasn't convinced, but she let it go. For the next few nights, nothing happened. The stain didn't reappear, and the apartment was silent. She began to think she'd imagined the whole thing, until the following Tuesday. She woke up to the sound of a loud crash. Her bed had moved, shifted several feet across the room. Her heart raced as she turned on the light, her eyes scanning for an explanation. The stain was back, larger now and dripping steadily. But it wasn't water. The liquid was thick and dark, almost black. And in the center of the stain, something was pushing through. It wasn't a bubble this time. It was a hand. The skin was gray and cracked, the fingers impossibly long. It pressed against the ceiling, the plaster bending under its weight until the hand slid through entirely, followed by an arm. Jenna screamed and bolted for the door, but before she could reach it, she heard the rasping voice. "Don't leave me here." She never stopped running. The next tenant to move into 12A didn't last long either. They complained of strange noises, stains that wouldn't go away, and the feeling that someone was watching them. The apartment is empty now, but on stormy nights, neighbors say they see the light in 12A flicker on and off. And if you stand in the hallway and listen closely, you can hear the faint sound of breathing, steady and raspy, as though something is still trying to claw its way out.